Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight.
Welcome back, young scholars. This is the second video on the executive branch. After watching these 3 videos, you should be able to answer these big questions. First, what are the qualifications to be a chief executive, whether it's a mayor or a president or governor of a state? Second, what are the roles of the president? What constitutional powers grant presidents the authority to carry out these roles? Today we're going to learn 7 of them. Second, how have the powers of the president expanded over time, and how have the president's powers been limited? So today we're going to focus on that second big question. What are the roles of the president? What constitutional powers grant presidents the authority to carry out these roles? One of the things that I'm going to encourage you to do to try and remember these 7 roles of the president is to do some hand gestures with me. So the very first thing I want you to do is take your right hand and raise it, and then to swear an oath. So this is the role of the chief executive. And here we're going to hear President Obama being sworn in at his inauguration. This happens on day 1 of the presidency by the Chief Justice, John Roberts.
Please raise your right hand and repeat after me. I, Barack Hussein Obama, do solemnly swear
I, Barack Hussein Obama, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute
that I will faithfully execute
the office of President of the United States
the office of President of the United States.
So the president has a really critical role of enforcing the laws of our country, right? To preserve, protect, defend the Constitution, and to ensure that the laws are carried out in a just way. So an example of this, in 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court decided the case of Brown versus Board of Education, which determined that segregated schools in the United States, so schools where there were only schools for white children and schools for children of color, that those separate schools were not permissible anymore under the US Constitution, and specifically the idea is that all people should be treated equally under the Equal Protection Clause. There were many people in the United States who were not pleased with this decision. One of them was Governor Orville Faubus from Arkansas. And so Governor Faubus said, no, we're not going to carry out the Supreme Court's order. So the president at the time was Dwight D. Eisenhower, and Eisenhower was faced with a dilemma, right? These states were ignoring a court order, and the U.S. Supreme Court's decision was a legitimate exercise of government in interpreting the U.S. Constitution. So one of the things that Eisenhower did was that he enforced that court order. He called up the U.S. Army and federalized the Arkansas National Guard, and he called upon them to help escort those students to school. And this is an image showing the Little Rock Nine going to school, surrounded by the U.S. military. And so that's an example of the power of the president to enforce, protect, and defend the requirements of the U.S. Constitution. The second thing I want you to do is take your finger, point it at somebody. Because another role that the president plays is they are the appointer in chief. They are responsible for nominating various folks within our government and appointing them to certain jobs.
Tonight, it is my honor and privilege to announce that I will nominate Judge Brett Kavanaugh to the United States Supreme Court.
So the president gets to nominate all federal judges, including Supreme Court justices. So they can typically, in the course of a 4 or 8-year presidency, appoint hundreds of different judges across the country. Now, just because they select the nominee does not mean they're automatically seated for that position. If you remember back to the way checks and balances work, it is the Senate's job then to confirm that person and decide, yes, that person should hold a federal judgeship. Now, the second group of people that the president appoints are members of his or her cabinet. We'll learn that there are different executive agencies within the U.S. government. So agencies like Department of Education or the State Department or Health and Human Services or the Justice Department. And so there are different secretaries who are appointed to those positions. These are some of the current secretaries in President Trump's cabinet. And then finally, foreign ambassadors. So each country the United States has diplomatic relations with is assigned an ambassador. President gets to appoint who those ambassadors are, and again, they are also confirmed by the Senate.
Dr. Price still lives, the scout oath, helping to keep millions of Americans strong and healthy as our Secretary of Health and Human Services, and he's doing a great job. And hopefully he's going to get the votes tomorrow to start our path toward killing this horrible thing known as Obamacare that's really... By the way, you going to get the votes? Oh, he better. Otherwise I'll say, Tom, you're fired. I'll get somebody.
So the president also has the power to fire any of these appointees at any time. That was a video of President Trump talking about his Secretary of Health and Human Services, Tom Price, and how he was trying to get votes to kill the law known as Obamacare. And it turns out that Secretary Price was not able to get the votes, and ultimately President Trump fired Tom Price. And that's totally within the president's power and discretion. And President Trump, more than any other president, probably enjoys exercising that power. The one exception to this is the president appoints or nominates the federal judges, but ultimately federal judges cannot be removed by the president. Federal judges hold their position for life and can only be removed through the process of impeachment.
My fellow Americans, a short time ago, I ordered the United States Armed Forces to launch precision strikes on targets associated with the chemical weapons capabilities of Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad.
So the third role the president plays is as commander-in-chief. We can remember the hand gesture and give a little salute, because as the president, you are the commander-in-chief. That's what the Constitution states. So the president is the head of the armed forces. He or she is responsible for overseeing the operation of the U.S. military and ensuring the security of the nation. And anywhere the president goes, this little suitcase goes along with him or her. That's the nuclear football is what it's referred to. And it contains nuclear codes in the event of the surprise launch of a nuclear war. And this is Harry Truman, the only president that has ever issued that command during World War II, shortly after becoming president, choosing to drop the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And we think about the president having this power as commander-in-chief, and so you'd think that it would be important for presidents to then have military experience. Most of the most recent presidents, including President Trump, President Obama, President George W. Bush, had some in the Texas National Guard, I believe. But very few presidents actually have had significant military experience, these three being the exception. These three were generals. This is General George Washington, General Ulysses S. Grant, and General Dwight Eisenhower. It's an interesting question. To what extent is it beneficial for the president to have military experience prior to holding this office, given that he is or she is the top of the command chain in the military?
I'm calling for bipartisan legislation that achieves the goal of dramatically lowering prescription drug prices. Get a bill on my desk and I will sign it into law immediately. With unyielding commitment.
So in that video, President Trump suggested that bipartisan legislation be submitted to him to address the issue of prescription drug prices. And you saw those people dressed in white. Those were primarily Democrats who were standing up chanting H.R. 3, which was the name of a bill that the Democratic House had passed and was sitting with the Senate Republicans who had not done anything with it. This represents the fourth role of the president. And so if you can remember this with simply taking out a piece of paper and writing your name down, signing your name, because one of the roles the president plays is as the chief policymaker. Now, what this means is the president sets a policy agenda and tries to influence the legislative process. So the president sets forth his or her vision for what laws they would like to see implemented in Congress. And then they try and twist the arms of various legislators to try and make that happen. So the president also has the power to veto legislation. If the president does not approve of that legislation, the power to veto is a check that the president has over Congress. and then Congress then can override that veto with a supermajority or 2/3 vote in both houses.
The buildup was dramatic. President Trump and North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un walked toward each other from opposite sides of the joint security area in the DMZ, the demilitarized border zone that separates North and South Korea. Then a handshake before the president's single footstep made him the first sitting U.S. president to enter North Korea.
So the fifth role the president plays is as the chief diplomat. You saw it there with President Trump meeting with President Kim of North Korea. And the role the president plays is they have an obligation to meet with other heads of state and to try and create good diplomatic relations with other states. So the president meets with other heads of state and oversees U.S. foreign policy. Here we see President Trump meeting with the Prince of Saudi Arabia. The president negotiates treaties with other states as part of this. The Constitution gives the president that power to negotiate treaties, but if you'll recall, the Constitution then gives the Senate the final authority about whether or not to ratify that treaty. So a good example of this was Woodrow Wilson after World War I negotiated the Treaty of Versailles. When Woodrow Wilson brought that treaty back to the United States, it was the Senate who decided not to ratify the Treaty of Versailles.
America today is on bended knee in prayer for the people whose lives were lost here, for the workers who work here, for the families who mourn. This nation stands with the good people of New York City and New Jersey and Connecticut as we mourn the loss of thousands of our citizens. I can hear you. I can hear you. The rest of the world hears you. And the people who knock these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
That was George W. Bush, the president at the time of 9/11, discussing what the government response would be to the attacks during 9/11. And so the role here is the sixth role, which is as chief citizen, or sometimes referred to as the comforter in chief. Because one of the things that the president has to do is to go to places where there are significant crises or tragedies unfolding and to provide that sort of inspiration and ultimately to inform Americans and comfort them in a time of need and a time of crisis, and also to serve as a model of American values.
Butter, let's talk to you for a second, because I'm going to do something that you're going to be very happy about. Butter, I wish you a lot of luck, but I hereby grant you a full and complete pardon.
So that is President Trump at the official turkey pardoning ceremony, which happens every year right before Thanksgiving. The role the president is playing here is as chief of state. So you can take your hand and put it over your heart, and hopefully that you can remember that the president plays a ceremonial role in the United States. And so the president represents the United States at official ceremonies, both at home and abroad, whether it is through giving medals, for instance, the Presidential Medal of Freedom here, which is given to Muhammad Ali, or throwing out the first pitch at the World Series, or giving the annual State of the Union address. That is a ceremonial function that's required by the Constitution. That is the role of chief of state. So where does the president get the authority to carry out these roles?
It's in the Constitution.
Exactly, it's in the Constitution. So the president's authority to carry out these roles is spelled out in Article 2 of the Constitution, mainly Article 2, Section 2. How do you remember these 7 different roles the president serves? Again, I've suggested that hand gestures can help. So take your right hand, raise your right hand, and you'll be giving an oath, which you can hopefully remember is the chief executive role. You can take your finger, you can point it at people, because as the president, you are the appointer in chief. You can take your hand and give a salute because you are also the commander-in-chief if you're the president. You can sign some pieces of paper, sign some bills, and that reminds you of the role of chief policymaker. You can extend your hand and try and shake someone's hand because that is the role of chief diplomat. You can give someone a nice hug in a time of need to comfort them. That's the role of chief citizen. And then finally, put your hand over your heart, the ceremonial role of Chief of State. So as a result of watching this video, you should be able to answer this big question. What are the roles of the president? What constitutional powers grant presidents the authority to carry out these roles? As always, thanks for watching.